Happy Friday! Happy Friday! Welcome back to Drinking by My Shelf. It is coming up to the football Men's World Cup season, and so in celebration I am going to do a World Cup of the best books that I read this year. So I have printed out here a bracket to put the top 16 books that I've read this year in. Raf is my glamorous off-screen assistant and she's got all the names in a bowl. So I have read 10 5-star books this year, and I also put in the best of the 4-star books. And who knows, an underdog might win the whole thing. I'm going to fill out my bracket. Here she goes. The first book is Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes, which was a 4-star read, a very good one. The next team to make the cut, Early Morning Riser. I have an early morning prediction that might win the whole thing. Oh, so that means that Stone Blind is playing Early Morning Riser, that's how that works. Next up, The Twyford Code, another 4-star read that Raf said she was 5-ing up. I might agree. Twyford Code is going to be competing against Everything You Ever Wanted. Competition number 3 is between The Paper Palace, strong contender, and is your arm aching yet? Stir Fry by Emma Donoghue. So far they've all been 4s against 5s. Very interesting. Makes it a kind of easy first round. Carrie Soto is back, competing against Everything's Fine. Ooh, that's a book that's not out yet. You can't read it. I can. It's really good. Okay, right. We're on to the second half of the page. We are going to see The Men, a controversial book, competing against Great Circle. Open Water, beautiful book, is going to be pitted against Small Pleasures. That was my favourite holiday read this year. Sorrow and Bliss, competing against Briefly a Delicious Life. Final 2 books are Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel and Still Life. In those opening rounds, just by coincidence, there are very clear underdogs playing against favourite books of the year. There are only 2 games that are going to be 2 top tier books against each other. Open Water versus Small Pleasures is a tough one. I don't know who's going to win. And Sea of Tranquility against Still Life is a really tough one because those were 2 of my top books of the year. So this is the first knockout round. Let's see who wins. Okay, it's match day. And first up we have Stone Blind against Early Morning Riser. This is tough because Early Morning Riser, I've said from the beginning, I think is going to be my #1 book of the year, which is potentially a spoiler for the end of this video. But the thing is, Stone Blind was a really strong team this year. Stone Blind was my favourite of all of the Natalie Hayneses that I've read. I've loved all of them. Stone Blind was so much fun. This was a Medusa retelling. It brought in a load of different myths. It was really, really funny. I think it was her funniest so far. I loved it. I really hoped it would go further in the competition, but it just can't be Early Morning Riser. There's nothing I can do. So that's a win. Early Morning Riser will be advancing. Next up, we are seeing The Twyford Code against Everything You Ever Wanted. This is an interesting one. So Everything You Ever Wanted was a 5-star read for me. The Twyford Code, I gave it 4 stars, but it was a bit of an internal battle. I buddy read this one with Raf. We had a lot of fun while reading it. Why did we give it 4 in the end? I don't remember. We felt that there were a few plot holes in the book, which is why I think ultimately we gave it a 4. Not everything lined up perfectly, but we loved reading it so much. It was definitely the more fun reading experience of the 2. Everything You Ever Wanted was pretty depressing, but it was a brilliant book. But when you put the 2 of them together, I might just surprise myself. It could have gone either way. It's really down to the conditions on the day. Do I sound like a football commentator? I'm gonna say it. It's a surprise win from the underdog. The Twyford Code is gonna win that one. Next up, we have The Paper Palace playing against Stir Fry. Again, Paper Palace was a 5-star book. Stir Fry was a 4-star book, but I really loved it. But I think that's got to be quite an easy win for The Paper Palace. It is one that has stuck with me. I thought about it a lot, partly because it had this slightly ambiguous ending and that always leaves you churning things over. What's tricky is, if I was going to reread one of those books right now, I would reread Stir Fry. Just goes to show there is no logic in football because I'm sticking with it. The Paper Palace has to win this one. It was such a good book. Next up, Everything's Fine versus Carrie Soto is Back. This is quite a fun one. Two very fun, accessible books I think will be really popular. Carrie Soto's already out. Everything's Fine isn't out until next summer, but I think will appeal to a lot of the same readership, but also broader. Both of them tap into deeper issues, but are still kind of easy summer read page turners. So similar types of books. I think these are both books that I wanted to talk about a lot after reading them, which is such a great sign of a book, but I think I will be talking for longer about Everything's Fine. And so it's the winner. Okay, we're halfway through the first round. We are now going to see The Men against Great Circle. Both very interesting books. The Men was absolutely bizarre. It was a wild book that went completely off-piste at the end. I was loving it until the end. You've seen me review this one. It was really strange. If it had nailed the ending, it could have been a stronger contender, but Great Circle is just one of, the second I finished reading Great Circle, I was like, this is my favourite book of the year. It has since been replaced because I've read so many good books, but it's got to be up there, so it's got to win. Open Water against Small Pleasures is actually the first time in this tournament that we have seen two 5-star books against each other. Open Water was a very short, very, very beautiful book. It's a book I read right at the beginning of the year, so I'm struggling to remember it in as much detail, and actually it was a book that hasn't stuck with me as much. I think because it was so short, I read it pretty much all in one go. So it was this beautiful reading experience. It wasn't one that stayed with me for as long. Small Pleasures, I have remembered more about, partly because it had more of a high concept premise. It is about a woman who claims to have had a baby without having sex. So she claims this was a virgin birth, and our main character is a journalist who is looking into this story. Open Water had the more beautiful writing. Small Pleasures was the more page-turning, enjoyable read. I read it on a summer holiday and loved it. Open Water probably opened up more issues to think about. It was a book that showed me looking at life from someone very different from me's perspective, which is a great thing in a book. Small Pleasures had the mystery element to keep me guessing. It's a really tricky one. So we're going to penalties. I have 5 categories here: plot, characters, writing, themes, and enjoyment. And we're going to have a penalty shootout. So, plot, Small Pleasures. Characters, Open Water. Writing, I think it's got to be Open Water. I really liked Claire Chambers' writing in Small Pleasures, but Open Water was like a poem. Themes, lots to explore in both books here. But I think themes has got to be Open Water, which means it's going to win. For enjoyment, I would have said Small Pleasures. So again, it's really, really close, but Open Water has won. Wow, that was unexpected. Didn't know what was going to happen there. Sorrow and Bliss is playing against Briefly a Delicious Life. Sorrow and Bliss was a 5-star read that at the time I was wavering between a 5 and a 4. Briefly a Delicious Life was a 4-star read that at the time I was wavering between a 4 and a 5, so that's interesting. Briefly a Delicious Life was a book that it was the one that surprised me more. I didn't know what I was going to make of it. It's about historical characters, real historical figures I didn't know anything about. So I wasn't sure if I'd be interested in their story, but I loved it. Sorrow and Bliss is the book I would recommend to more people. I'd recommend that very, very widely. Without knowing much about someone's reading taste, I could comfortably recommend them Sorrow and Bliss. Briefly Delicious Life is much more niche. But the people that I have recommended it to, I've been very excited to recommend it to them very specifically. We're back in extra time again. We're gonna go to penalties again. Right, plot, briefly. Characters, it's hard, that's really hard. Martha is the main character of Sorrow and Bliss and she's hilarious. Blanca is the main character of Briefly Delicious Life and she is a ghost, so that's cool. Sorrow and Bliss. Writing, very, very different styles of writing, so that is hard. Nell Stevens' writing is beautiful. Meg Mason's writing is so funny that I think it's got to be her. Themes, also really hard. Sorrow and Bliss is about mental health and Briefly Delicious Life is about sexuality. I like both of those things. I'm going to put Briefly for themes, which means that we're down to the final category of enjoyment, and I still don't know. Enjoyment, it was a tie. The front cover, they're both great. It's another tie. Gayness. Is that allowed? Yeah, I'm gonna do that. In queerness, then Briefly Delicious Life wins, and so I think the gay book has to win. Briefly Dishes Life has won. That is so confusing to me. Sorrow and Bliss was a book I loved and have raved about, but somehow it has been knocked out at the first stage. Sports is brutal. And this final category is the one that I've been dreading all morning. Sea of Tranquility versus Still Life. These were two 5-star books. These were two such different books. I don't know how to pit them against each other. Still Life was funny and joyful. It's about this eccentric cast of characters. It spans several decades. You spend time in Italy, and I read it in Italy, so that was great. Sea of Tranquility is a time travel book, and I love time travel books. It's Emily St. John Mandel, and I absolutely love her writing. It's really meta. It's a book that while I was reading it, I kept just sort of saying to myself, I'm enjoying this so much. But I also felt that with Still Life. This is the hardest competition so far. This game is a lot harder than I ever imagined it would be. I don't want either of them to go. This is too hard. I want to go. I can't do it. I don't want to be a football commentator anymore. Can I just roll a dice? My heart can't take this. 3 penalty shootouts in a row. In a row. I'm already stuck. Plot. I don't know. The thing is, they're so different. Like, how do you compare the plot of this like ragtag bunch of weirdos going to Florence versus the plot of traveling through 500 years worth of time? Who would win in that? Who would win? You think Sea of Tranquility? Okay. I mean, I guess I did repeatedly say while I was reading Still Life that this book has no plot, but I meant it as a compliment because I love books with no plot. That's the kind of plot that I like. However, yeah, there was more story in Sea of Tranquility, so that's getting that. Characters, easy win for Still Life. Just the best characters in any book I've read. Writing, so different. So different. I think probably the writing in Still Life is more my favourite type of writing, but Emily St. John Mandel is a really, really good writer, so that's very difficult, but I'm giving that to Still Life. Themes, like on the surface, Still Life is more about art. You know, it's more like art and culture, and Sea of Tranquility is more like time and the meaning of life. So I'm gonna go with that one. Did you have something to say? Enjoyment, it's a tie. Next category is front cover. I prefer Still Life, which means Still Life wins. Whew, that was tense. And then if we'd gone to the 7th category of gayness, Still Life would have won again. I can say whatever I like. Okay, whew. The first round is complete. We have lost some really beautiful books in this. I'm very sad to have lost Sea of Tranquility. I am very baffled to have lost Sorrow and Bliss. We are into the quarterfinals now, which I will do later this afternoon. Okay, I am done with work and I am almost emotionally ready for round 2 of this competition. As emotionally ready as I ever can be. We're into the quarterfinals, got 8 really good books, 4 matches. First up, we have Early Morning Riser versus the Twyford Code. Now, the Twyford Code was a surprise in this competition. This was a 4-star book that just somehow came along and wiped out a 5-star book, and now it's faced against my favourite book of the year. I don't want to make this too obvious that I'm going to pick Early Morning Riser, so let's think about this carefully. The Twyford Code was such a fun reading experience. As I said, it was a buddy read. It's a book with a puzzle that you're kind of trying to solve as you go along, so it felt really interactive. I did love it. I will be sad to see it out of the competition. However, Early Morning Riser just changed my life, so Early Morning Riser has to win. Next up, we have The Paper Palace versus Everything's Fine, and this is a really, really hard one. They're very different books. The Paper Palace spans about 50 years, so we actually have 2 timelines in our main character's life. I can't remember the name of the main character, but we have about 24 hours in her present day when she has just slept with a man who isn't her husband, but is her long-time love, her childhood friend. They have a lot of history, they've been through a lot together, and we go back and we follow her 50 years of life so far. So we keep flashing between this kind of long, sweeping story and the 24 hours where she has to make this decision about what to do next. It's a really moving book. There's a lot of trauma in her past. I loved this one. I really felt torn along with her. I didn't know what she should do next. Everything's Fine is a very different book. This is set in a shorter time frame, spans about a year. It's about a girl called Jess who has graduated from uni. She's gone into her first job. She's working in finance. She is most of the time the only black girl in the room, surrounded by white, conservative, preppy, rich guys, including Josh, who is a guy that she knew from uni and thought was a total arse at the time. Now she's getting to know him the second time around. He does seem to have changed in some ways. He admits that he was a bit of a douche back in the day. And while they obviously do not share the same politics and have very different views on a lot of things, there are a lot of things that they find they have in common. They end up falling in love, but the book is set in 2016 in the build-up to Trump's election, and the closer it gets to that and the more important politics becomes to our main character Jess, the more she realises that perhaps everything isn't fine. So, very different books, very different readerships, very just different experiences I had. Who would win in a battle of these two? The Paper Palace has an advantage in that it does span such a long period of time, and that's something I really love in a book. That's just a personal love of mine. However, Everything's Fine is probably the book that I would recommend to the most people. I really want to push this into loads of people's hands. I don't even know if I did it justice from the description just then. I was kind of skeptical from hearing that there was going to be a love story between a liberal and a conservative, and actually reading it, it all made sense, all fell into place. And as well as being about the love story, it's so much about Jess as a character, and she's such a good character, so nuanced. You see why and how she finds herself adopting the values of the people around her in order to survive. And I just think that's a book so many people should read. It will spark so many conversations. And so, despite how much love I feel for the Paper Palace, I'm gonna send Everything's Fine through to the semi-finals. Next up, we have Great Circle versus Open Water. Again, massively different reading experiences. Great Circle is really long. I don't know the page count, but it's a chunky book, and Open Water is a really short book that you can read all in one sitting. So very different experiences. These books are kind of going in on an even footing. They're both books that I adored. They're both books that aren't, neither one of them is fresher in my mind than the other, so neither of them has the advantage there. The writing in both of them was gorgeous, particularly Open Water. It does have this really poetic writing, as I mentioned before. Great Circle has more layers of storytelling, and that is something that I adore in a book. If you watched my video last week on the formula for my perfect book, Great Circle hit a lot of those boxes. I think on balance, it's got to be Great Circle because I was so swept up in that story. It captured my imagination in such a big way. Great Circle's got to go through. And finally, Briefly a Delicious Life meets Still Life. So two books with life in the title. Two books that made it through because they got to the stage of the penalty shootout where I introduced a gayness category. So quite similar so far. Briefly a Delicious Life is about a teenage ghost watching on as Chopin and his lover George Sand spends this terrible few months in a monastery in Mallorca. The main character is this ghost who has been there for centuries and centuries and watched hundreds of different characters go through, and she becomes fixated on these two as she has become fixated on people in the past. It's a story about longing. It's a book that, as I said before, just totally surprised me how engaged I was in this story. And I've met the author a couple of times. She came into work, most recently I met her because she came into work for a book club, and she's just fascinating and brilliant. I loved talking to her. I loved hearing about her writing process. I'm really keen to read more from her. That was a gorgeous read. It was a delicious reading experience, as the title would suggest. Still Life is, I've already told you what Still Life is about. It's about this huge cast of characters, which is something that I love in books. And it spans decades. We follow them through their whole lives. We get flashbacks. We follow them from the East End of London to Florence. I've been to visit the location where they live in Florence. It's again a really beautiful reading experience. They're very different stories, but they're quite similar in the way they made me feel while reading them, which was just that I wanted to sink into them. Any time spent not reading them was time wasted. I think either of these could have gone through, but going with what happens on the day. You can never predict what's going to happen, and my gut is telling me that Still Life has to win this game. So that is perhaps all my heart can take for tonight. I will catch back up with you when it's time for the semi-finals. We're down to 4 final books, and they're 4 brilliant books. We've also lost a lot of brilliant books. I'm finding this process more heartbreaking than I predicted that I would. Okay, we're down to the semi-finals. I gave myself a day break to cope with the emotional distress. We now have 2 semi-finals. The first one is Early Morning Riser against Everything's Fine. 2 really, really good books. Here's the thing. We know, I've said right from the beginning of this video that Early Morning Riser is, I think, my favourite book I've read this year. So we know that my enjoyment of Early Morning Riser, pretty impossible to beat. But these are 2 really strong books, so I want to make sure it's a fair game. Everything's Fine is the book that I think would appeal to a bigger audience. I think there is more to talk about in it. I think it covers more important issues. It covers more issues. I think it's a brilliant book. I think it's a really, really thought-provoking book. Early Morning Riser is a much simpler book. It's just, the reason I loved it so much is the humour and the characters who are all kind of absurd, but you feel like they're real and lovable, and I just enjoyed the gentleness of following them through their lives. So it's a very different kind of book. Ultimately, this is the semi-final of my favourite books of the year, and so while it is a really difficult choice, it's not a difficult choice because I don't know the answer, because Early Morning Riser has won that game. The next one is going to be harder. I don't know what the outcome of this is going to be. This is Great Circle against Still Life. And just looking ahead, it's going to be very interesting. If Still Life were to win this game, it would mean that the final is Early Morning Riser versus Still Life, which would be very funny because they are identical books. So that might happen, but we just don't know. I honestly don't know at this stage. Let's remind ourselves some of the best moments of these books. So in Great Circle, the character of Marion is fantastic. You meet her, you follow her throughout her life. You see her as this young girl, this young adventurous girl who wants to be a pilot and loves being in the sky. You watch as her spirit gets broken from this terrible marriage that she's in. You follow her through success and disaster, and you don't know what happens at the end. I know what happens at the end, but it's very stressful. You also get another great character of Kirsten Stewart, whose name I don't actually remember, Hadley, I think it's Hadley, who is the actress playing her. And she was just a really fun character to read. So these 2 women in that story, I loved reading about them. I read the book very slowly, kind of deliberately, because I didn't want to not be reading it anymore. It's a good sign. Best moments of Still Life, it's very different. It's got the same kind of sweeping nature, but it's much more ridiculous. Great Circle is not a ridiculous book at all. It's not that it takes itself too seriously, but it's not making fun of itself, whereas Still Life is. The characters are deliberately heightened. Reality is heightened. It's a sillier, more whimsical book, which is a good thing. So both good in different ways. Which one would I be more likely to reread? Which one would I want to recommend to more people? Let's think about these questions. I think I would recommend Great Circle to more people because Still Life, I think, is going to appeal to a more particular type of reader. I think it wouldn't be for everyone. Would you agree with that? You disagree with that? Interesting. I think the reason I thought that is because it's got more plot to push you through. I think that I have a gut instinct and I wasn't sure. I'm kind of doing the thing. Do you ever do this thing where if you can't decide what to eat at a restaurant, you get someone to randomly pick one of them and then you know if you feel disappointed or not? I just did that to myself, and while both of them are books that I loved, there was one of them that I felt more sad about not winning. Do you know what I'm going to say? Yeah. I think the winner of the semi-final has to be Great Circle. Oh, it's really hard. It was really hard, but it happened. It happened. Sometimes these things happen. Great Circle won. That was the semi-finals. They're done now. They're done. Okay, the time has come. I can't put it off anymore. I tried to put this off. We're now 2 days later again. I managed to develop a case of food poisoning and was sick for about 24 hours, which stopped me from filming anything. That started pretty much instantly after the last clip that I filmed. Maybe it was brought on by the stress of choosing between such good books, but the day is here. It is the World Cup final of books. My bracket is looking rather crumpled now. In this final, we have Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead playing against Early Morning Riser by Katherine Heiny. And it's no surprise that these two books have made it through to this stage in the competition. These are my two favourite books of the year. It'd be really interesting to see if the names were drawn in different orders, if we would have had a different result, or if it's just inevitable that these two books are facing each other at this stage in the competition. And honestly, at this point in me filming it, I've got no idea who's going to win. I really don't. They have differences and similarities. Both of them are books that span big periods of time. They are these sweeping stories. One of them is much more of an epic. It's about a female pilot flying, circumnavigating the globe. The other one is very small in scale. It's about a group of people living in a small town and just living a very normal life there. Great Circle is, I would say, the more expertly crafted novel. It is the better book, probably. Early Morning Riser is simpler and quieter, but it is more joyful. Both of these books had me completely engrossed. So whatever the result, this is going to be a good game. I mean, it goes without question that this game is going to extra time because I need a lot of time to think about my decision here. Can it be a tie? Is that a cop out? I've been saying from the very beginning of this competition that I think Early Morning Riser is going to win, but now that it's got there, Great Circle might just beat it. It's Great Circle just playing really well on the day. It might just be inevitable that we have to go to a penalty shootout. First up we have Plot, which is a clear win for Great Circle. Next up, Characters. I'm going to say that's a clear win for Early Morning Riser. They're ridiculous. They're just ridiculous. Writing. Maggie Shipstead's writing is beautiful, but Katherine Heiny's writing is so funny that I've got to give it to Early Morning Riser. Themes is a hard one. Great Circle, I loved what that book was about. It was about these layers of storytelling. It was about who owns the truth of your story. I loved that. It was so clever. Early Morning Riser was about love, which is beautiful. It was about discovering love in ordinary places. They're good in different ways. Early Morning Riser was something that I felt more, I took something personally from it. It kind of showed you how to find joy in your life. That's why I could describe this book as life enhancing. But Great Circle was one that I thought more about. I love that kind of thing in a book. And so for the thought-provokingness of it, I'm going to give that one to Great Circle. Then we have Enjoyment. This is just classic. I enjoyed both of them. I enjoyed both of them so much. We know this. That's how we got here. This is a stupid category. It's a tie. It's a tie. It's still a tie. Which means we have to go to a sudden death. And the next category in my penalty categories was cover. Okay, so here are the covers. The thing is, neither of these covers are my favorite book covers. But I do like Early Morning Risers a lot better. Great Circles is pretty meh for me. Early Morning Riser is pretty. And so Early Morning Riser has just won the World Cup. That was unexpected. I mean, it wasn't unexpected. I've been saying it from the beginning. But I suddenly just didn't think it was going to happen. Oh, it's so weird. It's so weird. I guess this is how football works. I don't watch the World Cup for this reason. I find it too stressful. And I guess this is something what happens. A team might win the World Cup based on like a not particularly good goal, but they're still a good team. It's just that that goal was like a slightly anticlimactic way to win the World Cup, I guess. I wouldn't have called it a World Cup winning book cover. And it's just luck of the draw. Oh my god, I'm learning so much about how football works. Because if we'd gone to the next penalty category, it would have been queerness, in which case Great Circle would have won it. So it's just the order that it happened. Is this how football fans feel all the time? I feel overwhelmed. I feel truly overwhelmed. But I was right, because I did say I thought that Early Morning Riser was going to win, and it did. And somehow, despite knowing that from the beginning, it surprised me. I really thought Great Circle was going to knock it out of the park at the last minute. Great Circle played really well, a great team. They should all be really proud of themselves. Handshakes all round. I hate football. Let me know in the comments below if you also just knew this was going to happen the whole time, or if there was another book that you were rooting for to steal the competition. And thank you for watching along my World Cup of books. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for new videos every Friday, and I'll see you next time.
you're smiling